Kuzo Zangpola. Welcome to Bhutan e-learning program. This is an environmental science lesson for Key Stage 5 of classes 11 and 12. I am Ugenwang Mutenzen of Motethang Higher Secondary School. Now before I introduce my lesson, let me play a video.
Imagine yourself in the future, let's say the year 2050. A future where biodiversity is valued and conserved, where it provides us with food, health, clean air, and water. Biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth, including plants, animals, and microorganisms. This future is the outcome of a vision, agreed upon among countries, to stop the decline in biodiversity. Several decades ago, things looked differently. Since the Industrial Revolution, biodiversity had been declining. In 2015, we realized that in the last 40 years, 4.6 million square kilometers of natural area was converted. This equals the size of Europe. This was caused by us. Crops and livestock replaced many nature areas, and even 1/3 of all food produced was being wasted. 90% of oceans were fully or overexploited. We were building more roads and clearing large areas of forest for timber and paper. If continued, this would have led to another 10% of biodiversity loss globally by 2050. Mostly in areas that still had a large number of species. Aggregated, this effect would be similar to cutting down a pristine forest the size of China. It would have had major consequences for us humans. Loss of nature areas would have aggravated climate change. It would have caused more floods and droughts. Lack of diversity would have made crops more vulnerable to pests and diseases. So what did we do to change course? We stepped up our sustainability initiatives. Protected areas were expanded and more effectively managed. There were large-scale changes across governments and societies. For example, production standards improved. Technology enabled us to grow more food on less land. We reduced our meat and dairy consumption, using less land to feed animals, and we reduced our food waste. These changes helped to halt the decline in biodiversity. Imagine yourself in the year 2050. Biodiversity is valued and conserved. Our future is not fixed.
Well, students, did you enjoy the video? Was it meaningful? Did you understand the key concept in the video? Now, related to the video, let us discuss some questions and answers so that you can understand the topic of our lesson today. The first question that I would like you to think about is, what is biodiversity? Here is a picture I am projecting as a hint to guess the answer for the question. All right. Biodiversity is the shortened form of two words, biological and diversity. It refers to a variety of life forms on the earth, which includes the plants, the animals, microorganisms, their genes, and the terrestrial, marine, and freshwater ecosystem which they are a part. Now, the second question I would like you to think about is, why is biodiversity important? Let me show you another picture. Well, these are diverse types of ecological services of biodiversity. It signifies that biodiversity is not only important for its intrinsic value, but also provides the basic conditions necessary for human survival. It includes, number one, provisioning services such as food, water, timber, fiber, and genetic resources. Number two, regulating services such as regulation of climate, floods, diseases, water quality as well as waste treatment. Number 3, cultural services such as recreation, aesthetic enjoyment and spiritual fulfillment. Number 4, supporting services such as soil formation, pollination and nutrient cycling. Now, the next question that I want you to think about is, what are some of the major issues in biodiversity? All right. With ever increasing human population and changing lifestyle of people, more and more land is being used for agriculture, for housing, for transport, for industries, construction of bridges, dams and other developmental activities. Enormous quantities of unmanaged waste are also discharged into the environment. The deteriorations of environmental conditions, pollutions, disappearance of forest, overexploitation of natural resources and loss of natural habitats are endangering the species. In few cases, species of plants and animals have been extinct due to exploitation, decreasing the biodiversity of ecosystem. Now, realizing all the potential threats to the biodiversity, the next question we must all wonder would be, what can we do to curb these threats? Yes, the correct answer is conserve biodiversity. In this lesson, we are going to discuss about how we can conserve biodiversity. Therefore, the topic of our lesson today is conservation of biodiversity. Now, let us look at our lesson objectives. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to, number 1, explain the biodiversity conservation efforts in Bhutan. Number 2, examine the linkages between protected areas and livelihood of people. Number 3, analyze the economic values of biodiversity conservation in poverty alleviation. Let us first discuss on the biodiversity conservation initiatives in Bhutan. The biodiversity of Bhutan holds a global significance with respect to the presence of some globally endangered and threatened species found in our country. Besides, Bhutan is also home to some of the endangered endemic species. Now, when we talk of endemic species, we are referring to those species being unique to a defined geographic location. For example, you can see the picture. You can guess what the picture shows. Yes, it is Myconopsis guccidiana, popularly known as the blue poppy, which is one such example of endemic species in our country. The global conservation priorities have been developed by conservation organizations like Ministry of Agriculture and Forest, Bhutan Trust Fund for Environmental Conservation, National Biodiversity Center, Royal Society for Protection of Nature and many more, and they are adopted in the National Framework for Biodiversity Conservation in Bhutan. The conservation priorities are based on number of criteria such as number 1, nativeness, rarity, endangered status and economic value, irreplaceability and vulnerability. The commitment of Bhutan towards conservation of the environment is immortalized in the Constitution, which has been translated into numerous policies and acts. Let us look into some of the acts and policies for conservation of biodiversity. The biodiversity conservation initiatives are guided by various acts and policies, wherein two prominent strategies include both in situ and ex situ conservation. Let us look into the in situ conservation efforts in Bhutan. First of all, in situ conservation is a strategy of conserving flora, that is plants, and fauna, that is animals, within their natural habitats. Bhutan has managed more than 70% of the land under forest cover for in situ conservation. Example of in situ conservation includes the development of national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, strict nature reserves, biological corridors, and also by declaring the lakes, the mountains, the forest as sacred sites. Now let us discuss about the national parks in Bhutan. According to IUCN, which stands for International Union for Conservation of Nature, it defines national park as large natural or near natural areas set aside to protect large-scale ecological processes along with the complement of species and ecosystem characteristics of the area, which also provides the foundation for environmentally and culturally compatible, spiritual, scientific, educational, recreational, and visitor opportunities. There are 5 national parks in Bhutan. Number 1, the Wangchuk Centennial Park, which is considered as the largest national park in Bhutan, covering the northern territory. Second, Jigme Dorji National Park, which lies in the northwestern part of Bhutan. Third, the Royal Manas National Park, which is in the southern central foothills. Fourth, Jigme Singye Wangchuk National Park in central Bhutan, and fifth, Phomshingla National Park, which is in eastern Bhutan. Now let us discuss next on wildlife sanctuaries. Wildlife sanctuaries refers to those areas which provide protection as well as favorable living conditions for flora and fauna. There are 4 wildlife sanctuaries. In Bhutan, we will look into each one of the 4 wildlife sanctuaries. Number 1, Bumdaling Wildlife Sanctuary. 2, Sakten Wildlife Sanctuary, Jomotsangkha Wildlife Sanctuary, and the 4th, Phipsu Wildlife Sanctuary. Now talking about the strict nature reserve. Nature reserves are strictly protected areas set aside to protect biodiversity and also possibly the geological and geomorphological features where human visitation, use, impacts are strictly controlled and limited to ensure the protection of conservation values. An example can be the Jigme Khesar Strict Nature Reserve. Now talking about the biological corridors. These are geographically defined areas which provides connectivity between the landscapes, the habitats and the ecosystems, and also ensures the maintenance of biodiversity and ecological and evolutionary processes. Bhutan has in total 8 biological corridors connecting the national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, and the strict nature reserve. The largest corridor covers an area of 577.9 square kilometer connecting Jigme Singye Wangchuk National Park, Wangchuk Centennial National Park, and Jigme Dorji National Park. The smallest corridor covers an area of 209.12 square kilometers connecting Royal Manas National Park to Jomotsangkha Wildlife Sanctuary. The second conservation effort is the ex situ conservation. Ex situ conservation is a strategy in which the threatened or the endangered species of plants and animals are reared and preserved outside their natural habitats. This type of method is developed through establishment of gene banks, off-site collections, tissue cultures, and many more. If you look at the picture, you can very well guess the popular animal. Yes, the takins in the Motithang Takin Preserve, that is in Thimphu, is a very good example to understand ex situ conservation strategy for the protection of our national animal. Secondly, the gene bank is yet another institute that collects and stores genetic materials of both flora and fauna. Genetic materials of animals are preserved for reproduction, genetic engineering, and preservation of threatened species. Similarly, tissues and vegetative parts of all native species are stored in the gene bank for sustainable use and food security. Seed Gene Bank is one of the effective institutions preserving variety of native seeds. Example, we have Gene Bank in Buli Jemgang, and we also have the Royal Bhutan Gene Bank. Now the third ex situ conservation effort is through tissue culture techniques. Tissue culture technique is one of the effective methods to preserve critically endangered species of plants and animals. It is a technique used for multiplication of plants and animals by callus formation, pollen grain culture, and shoot tip culture through in vitro cultivation under controlled and aseptic conditions. The National Seed Center in Paro focuses on such techniques to grow important plants. Next, let us analyze how protected areas could affect the livelihood of the rural communities inhabiting near the protected areas. Generally, we know that the protected areas are located in places where the rural inhabitants have the least participation in the country's economy. Thus, poor people and protected areas tend to be inextricably linked in a diverse and complex manner. For instance, strict rules by the government on the conservation of biodiversity in protected areas may cause socio-economic loss, especially to the poor people inhabiting near the protected areas, as they might be restricted or denied access to collect or harvest resources necessary for their survival. Communities near the protected areas may be displaced unwillingly owing to the threats they may possibly pose to the conservation of biodiversity. Also, without the proper regulation of the protected areas, the poor inhabitants may likely suffer from severe crop loss, livestock depredation, and even loss of human lives and injuries due to the wild animals. Thus, human-wildlife conflict has been a growing problem for the communities located within the protected areas. Even though some issues may arise due to the development of the protected areas, but by careful addressing these potential conflicts in an open and inclusive manner may benefit the rural people in alleviating poverty. Now, let us discuss how biodiversity can help alleviate poverty. The conservation of biodiversity is a sustainable measure that helps in keeping the natural resources intact. Rich biodiversity can create avenues for the people to generate income and in turn alleviate poverty. Some of the ways to alleviate poverty through biodiversity conservation may include: number 1, recreation and tourism. Biodiversity provides an avenue for recreational activities like trekking, bird watching, adventure, and educational research. Rich species of flora and fauna gives people a sense of love and affinity for nature. Rich biodiversity has high potential for nature-based tourism that helps to generate revenue and alleviate poverty in rural communities, mainly through the opportunities that the tourism services offer, like we have employment for the local communities as guides, guards, porters, etc. Second, earn revenue through the collection of tariffs, taxes, royalty and many more. Third, through the business establishments like hotels, guest house, traditional handicraft items. And fourth, we have establishment of service centers for hiring equipments like rafting facilities, trekking items, parachutes, diving materials, vehicles, horses, etc. The second advantage of biodiversity conservation in alleviation of poverty is in agriculture and food security. Biodiversity is essential for food production as well as food security. A rich biodiversity can enhance the ecological services, which generally influences the productivity of crops and livestock. The conditions that is favorable to those species community enhance the production of varieties of food crops. The excess produce in agriculture can generate income to alleviate poverty in the community. The third benefit of biodiversity conservation in poverty alleviation is by providing source for food and raw materials. Rich biodiversity also provide a variety of foods and raw materials for us. A wide range of food products such as fruits, vegetables, nuts, meats and food additives are obtained from the environment with rich biodiversity. Likewise, biodiversity is the source of raw materials for both traditional and modern medicine. Example, Ophiocordyceps sinensis. Do you know what we call these species in our local dialect? Good. It is known as Yasa Gyumbub. Now, after understanding all the benefits we could obtain from the conservation of biodiversity, we must ensure that we conserve our biodiversity in every possible way that we can. Now, before I close my lesson, I would like you to explore answers to these two simple questions. Number one, conservation of environment is one of the Bhutan's national priorities. Explore a middle path for economic development in the community without compromising the health of the biodiversity. The second question is, make an analysis of how biodiversity conservation alleviates poverty. Thank you very much, and I will see you in my next lesson.